strength has gone from being the niche for the athletes and gym bros into being foundational for the very, very vast majority of people. It used to be, it was like an add-on, an accessory. And I think you're seeing this big shift now that this is, whether it's parallel and joint with cardio or above cardio. I don't think it's a competition between the two at all, but it's foundational. This is a core component. But if you really want to care about longevity, train lower body power is probably the single best thing you can do for your health span and staying injury free or fall prevention free.
We're live. Welcome to this week's episode of Lifts. I'm Matthew Januszek, and I feel a little bit deflated by our intro because I was watching Tony Robbins. He's been doing this podcast circuit recently, been on a number of podcasts promoting one of his events, and I've been watching his pre-podcast preparation where he kind of gets himself into a peak state. So I really feel maybe for future episodes we need to be turning up the volume in terms of our energy. But anyway, I'm here with my co-host Mohammed. Iqbal. Mo, how are you doing today, and are you full of energy?
I'm full of energy. I think what he says is like, "Are you on fire?" Right? I think that's what Tony Robbins says. But I'm just curious because I haven't looked at that. What does he do? What are some tips so I can prep up the next time?
Well, you have your power move. I'm trying to think back to what he called it, but you kind of have your power move, and you have your incantations, and you're moving your body, and you're sort of you're shouting out your incantations, and you do that for a few minutes, and you get yourself into what he calls your peak state. So when I did a lot of the Tony Robbins stuff myself, it does work. Before I used to go into sales meetings, I'd be outside in the car park making my move and getting into peak state. So there's definitely something in it, and I probably need to bring that back, and next episode we'll be doing our moves, Mo.
I would love that. Sign me up. I've not been through his courses, but definitely been a fan for a while. Well, I'm excited for this episode because this is one I know, Matthew, you're close to, I'm close to, and we've been really looking forward to it because it sits at the intersection of a personal journey I've been on in the last year, which I'll get here to here in a minute. And it's also one of the most important shifts happening in health and fitness right now. And that shift is something we've been talking about on this podcast and any others that you listen to, which is the shift towards strength. And this has been happening for a long time. I would argue probably over the last 2 decades. But even before that, strength, especially when we were growing up, and everyone on this call here has really lived in a very specific lane that was focused a lot on aesthetics or performance, and in some cases, both. But that framing is changing fast. And what we're seeing now across consumer surveys, operative strategies, and real-world training data is that strength is being reframed as a foundational layer for longevity. So it's not just about looking good. It's not just about lifting heavier, but it's really about doing strength to stay capable, resilient, and independent for decades, like into your 40s, 50s, 60s, and well beyond. Over the past year, we've noticed that the language consumers are using around fitness has shifted in a meaningful way. Recent data from this year and last year has shown that over 40% of consumers now say that their top health goal is to simply get physically stronger. And nearly half say that they plan to lift more weights this year. At the same time, longevity has emerged as the wellness trend most likely to define 2026, even ahead of GLP-1s, wearables, which I love, and even AI-powered training. So people aren't just chasing short-term outcomes anymore. They're really rethinking about how they want to feel, move, and function, not for today, but years from now. And strength has become the connective tissue in that conversation. What's interesting is that the science behind this has been clear for a while. So we know that muscle strength declines with age if we don't actively train it. We've talked about that quite a bit on this podcast. We know that strength is closely tied to bone density, metabolic health, fall prevention, and quality of life. So what's new isn't the science, it's really the behavior change. And that brings me to a personal experience that I want to share a bit about. So I've been strength training since I've been about 14 or 15 years old in high school in New Jersey. And so strength has always been a part of my life, but I've really put endurance at the forefront. I love marathon training and riding and doing all the things. But last year, I decided to really make strength a priority. In fact, looking at my Strava data at the end of the year, I think my running had almost like a 70% dip, but my strength was up 200% in terms of time spent. And the device that I chose to build my kind of strength program on was Tonal. I've actually owned the Tonal for about 5 years. And so I've been pretty close to connected strength for a long time. But if I'm being honest, for most of those years, I was a casual user of Tonal, kind of using it, maybe a couple times a month if I needed to do certain motions. I'd lift here a little bit, but I mostly did Olympic style lifting. But this last year, I deliberately said, I'm going to use this machine and see if it actually works and if I can improve my strength in several areas. So I started training on a Tonal 4 to 5 times a week. And then I actually noticed change. So I know, Matthew, you said I've looked like I've bulked up a little bit, and that's true. I've gained 10 pounds. So I went from 165 to 175. And before we jump to conclusions, I'm going to choose to believe that most of it is muscle. But I actually feel stronger. I feel more durable. In fact, this morning I had a new PR in Tonal. And even though I still love to run, I just feel overall like better because of it. So that brings me to today's guest. I'm really excited to welcome for the second time Troy Taylor to Lift's podcast. Troy is part of the senior leadership team at Tonal, and he is obsessed and sits at the intersection of strength training, technology, and behavior change. And I think what makes Tonal so compelling for this conversation that we're about to have today on strength is that you can actually see how people train. Like they're actually able to quantify it through millions of workouts. So today we're going to be covering a bunch of things. One, what data is telling us about how people train. Second, why strength has become central to longevity. And third, what this means for operators and studios and the future of strength training. So before I hand it off to Matthew, welcome again to Lift, Troy.
Thank you for having me back. I certainly appreciate it. And it's been fun to see your journey over the last year training on Tonal.
Well, I guess, Matthew, before I have you go, now I'm curious because, Troy, you've got access to the back end and all the special things that I can't see. But what have you noticed in my last 12 months of training on Tonal?
Okay, so I just pulled up a little dashboard, and you have this on your app, so you can kind of see a lot of the data. But number one, you talked about like the increasing consistency, right? You if you look at over, I think you got the device in August 2021, somewhere
right.
around then when you did your very first session. And if you average your entire, like, how many weeks did Mo work out over that entire time? It's about 3 to 4. About 0.3 to 0.4. So every sort of 30 to 40% of the weeks that you've had Tonal, you actually trained on Tonal. If you look since basically February last year, you trained at least once a week, every single week, 100% consistency. Some of those weeks, it's sort of 3 or 4 times, which is most of the time. Some of it's like 5, 6, 7, 8 times a week if you maybe some busier weeks. So number one, like huge increase in consistency. Number two, we're seeing, like, just on the back end data, you made about a 15% increase in your overall strength as measured by strength score. 15 to 20%, somewhere in there, that kind of things over a single year. For someone who's been training for, you said what you started when you were 14 or 15, we don't typically make that bigger increases, when we've been training for a long period of time. We see it especially in your core strength as a big increase in your kind of core strength ability. And kind of things. So those are some of the highlights and kind of things. But as you could go into your app and dive in or specific kind of things, but you're lifting a lot more volume as well. We can see the volume of your sessions has gone from sort of, let's say 10,000 pounds a session on average up to 15 to 20 over the past year, as you've been not only training more, but doing more within each of those sessions.
It's been truly remarkable. And I think like being able to quantify every aspect of what I'm doing and be able to see that has also been a good motivation tool as well.
I think it's pretty interesting that, like, I do a lot of strength training, but I feel as though getting any useful metrics from my training, and I also put a lot of time into progressing my training, but just absolutely zero feedback. So I'm going to have to check in a little bit more to Tonal. But look, let's dig into the report. And you sent over the 2025 Tonal report, and just to give the listeners a bit of a background on it, you surveyed 677 Tonal members and analyzed outcome data from 32,000 Tonal members. And these members have between 6 months and 3 years of length with Tonal as of June 2025 and worked out at least 24 times for a maximum of 3 minutes with resistance on Tonal. So a bit of an overview of what the report covers, which is pretty extensive, really, compared to many research papers that are out there. And I thought before we get into the data, I wanted to refer to a Time magazine article and also a similar article that was picked up on Financial Times. And it says there's been a social narrative circulating recently, sometimes framed as the rich girl arm trend, where toned arms are being described as a new kind of status symbol. Not a bag, not a watch, but visible strength. And what's interesting is when you strip away the aesthetic language of toned arms, don't come from shortcuts. They come from resistance training, adequate protein, and years of consistency. So, and a few of the people that I've seen in the article, and I guess a great examples of this from a female side is you've got J-Lo, that's also in her 50s, Dua Lipa, which is a younger, sort of very well-known musician, Serena Williams, and also Miley Cyrus, that I guess would be great examples of this. So I guess my question to kick this off is that we've seen a huge amount of awareness around strength training, and certainly it's becoming this big cultural shift now. How do you see people value strength now from the tonal perspective, and how does this align with what your report shows about why people are actually strength training today?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift that I've noticed in consumers is strength has gone from being the niche for athletes and gym bros into being foundational for the very, very vast majority of people. It used to be, if I have time, I'll get to strength training after Mo's done his cardio, or like other things. It was like an add-on, an accessory. And I think you're seeing this big shift now that this is, whether it's parallel and joint with cardio or above cardio. I don't think it's a competition between the two at all, but it's foundational. This is a core component. And what we're seeing in our data and our membership is essentially people treating as that. I think something over around 80 to 90% of the sessions on Tonal are strength training. We have yoga, we have Pilates, we have some cardio training, we have some other, but strength is very much the foundation of our members. And they're saying it because I think the information that this is foundational for longevity, for living better, not just living longer, has become really kind of, it's second nature to many, many people now, in a way that even 5 years ago, I don't think it was. And so I think we're seeing that's proliferating through our entire data set as well as the general population.
This episode is brought to you by our partners at eGym. eGym believes the future of health starts on the gym floor, with strength training at the center. That's why they're building an ecosystem of connected equipment, AI-driven software, and wellness solutions to empower operators and improve lives. Their mission? To transform healthcare from repair to prevention and make fitness accessible, personalized, and measurable for exercisers of all shapes and sizes. See how this all fits together at egym.com.
I'm just curious too, when you think about, strength and looking at the report and even looking at like my own Tonal leaderboard, I noticed that a lot of people are between 40 in your 40s and 60s. Not many folks in your 20s. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's an expensive product. I mean, I think mine was $5K plus. It's an expensive subscription, but there's also a sense of community. So I can't help but think about the impact that CrossFit had on Olympic lifting. And I think even trickled down over to just regular strength training. And then to Matthew's point, this idea of aesthetics in some cases like arms, your butt, like whatever, being almost like a status symbol to show that you care about yourself, you're putting effort into yourself. So much of that, though, happens either as a group, when you think about strength group classes, or in a group setting. So I'm thinking about a gym with a row of racks. What role do you think that group environment and being around people is either a motivational lever or really means a lot for strength? Or do you think that is something that you could do at home in your garage gym or on your Tonal?
everyone's individual in terms of what they motivates them to get there to exercise. And I think the social community aspect of training for many, many people is a huge component, right? I'm only going to lift because, I get to see and chat and catch up and have that social interaction. There's mental health benefits to that as well as physical benefits. And so I think you can build like muscles, no tension, right? They know that they're lifting weight or resistance, and tension is being placed on them. What we see from our data is the people that have tonal use it very consistently. And that's number one, is am I going to do this consistently over time? And am I going, as Matthew said before, get progressive overload while I'm doing that? We've all been probably in the gym, and you see the same people that have been lifting the same weight for the same number of reps for the last 20 years.
Which was me, by the way, for like 15
Yeah,
years. Yeah.
yeah, me too. Having a home device or a smart device like Tonal, we have progressive overload built in, right? If you show the machine, actually, that was not that hard, a struggle score or reps in reserve. If you were more than 2 or 3 reps in reserve from failure and your goal is hypertrophy, we'll bump up the weight a little bit, 1 pound next time. And you can kind of get that progressive overload and you get that progress kind of built into the system. I actually released a post on LinkedIn that looked at all of our members, so hundreds of thousands of people, looked at their relative months, so how long they've been on Tonal, like standardized for when they start. And you see a 3% increase in volume lifted every single month that they're on Tonal as an entire population. So, 30 something percent increase in volumes year over year. And you're seeing this kind of link. It's only a little bit, but it's going up and up and up and up. And so things like that are kind of built into the system, which many people find super value for tracking progress. So I think community is important. And definitely important. And I think you can get community in person. I think we have an active Facebook group, Reddit groups. We just did an AMA in our Reddit group. I think it's 15,000 or so people in there. There's 60,000 in our Facebook group. So people get community in different ways. I am a fan of how people get to stay exercising and do it consistently over long periods of time, right? None of these changes happen. We're recording this in late January. Hopefully everyone's still motivated, but we want them training in March and June and September and the next January too, without these breaks. So I think we have to think around ways that we can just make it accessible, however people are going to get consistent.
So staying on the consistency, if you go to the report in part 1, there's a section, no time, no problem. And it shows that short targeted sessions, sometimes as little as 20 minutes, can still deliver meaningful strength gains. Based on that information, are you finding that in order to encourage consistency, giving people the information that they don't have to be in the gym or in front of Tonal for an hour long to get the results? Do you see that that's helping people to be more consistent with their workout program as a result of these shorter workouts? Yeah,
absolutely. Like average workout on Tonal is 35 minutes, and it stayed fairly steady at 35 minutes for a fairly long period of time. But what you're seeing is that's 35 minutes and Mo's working out in his pajamas. So there was no drive, there's no change. You can get a lot of work done in a very short period of time with time efficient training techniques like, supersets. So I'm doing an upper body movement and then a lower body, or a push and a pull. I'm I'm utilizing things like drop sets where we kind of create a way to accumulate more reps close to failure in a very short period of time. We try to come up with product and content and programming solutions that allow people to get in the right stimulus, the right training stimulus in shorter periods of time. We have quick fit workouts that are sort of 15 minutes, and then we have like 20 and 20s. So 20 days worth of programming in 20 minutes per day. We definitely see that people are more consistent when they can fit time in their stuff, when I don't have to think that, I've got to spend 90 minutes on Tonal or in a gym. I've got to do at least 10 sets per muscle group. Actually, no. The research evidence is very clear, and something we try to communicate to our members is, hey, 1 to 2 sets, your first set of an exercise is going to be the most beneficial, right? Going from nothing to something. You'll get the biggest muscle protein synthesis. You'll get the biggest muscle hypertrophy growth. You'll also get strong. There's research out there that says like strength, 3 to 5 sets of heavy lifting per week can make a massive difference in overall strength. So minimal effective dose training. And we certainly see that when people can make that shift, and that it's not an all or nothing. Yes, I'd love to work out for 45 or 60 minutes, but I only have 15 minutes today. This is a great plan B. And I can get this done. Or if you're like me, I'm a huge exercise snack fan. I work out for about 5 minutes, about 5 times a day.
Wow.
I go in, I do a couple of sets. I finish a podcast. I'm on a Zoom call. I got a thing. I'll go in, I do a quick warm up set, a heavy set. Okay. And I'll go back and my tonal is literally behind me in my home. So I can kind of go in and do that. And so I think it's allowing people the flexibility. What I think the research evidence shows to me and what we're hearing, what we don't hear enough of, but I think is really important is there are so many different ways we can get strong, fit and healthy. We don't have to be boxed into this is the exact way. And the more that we can encourage people that you have flexibility, as long as you're doing something, you're progressing, and is an important message, I think.
I just want to dig a bit deeper into the science of strength for a moment. And I forget, we had a really smart panelist on, or rather you did, in New York when I visited the Tonal training labs. And something else I actually have from that session. And we know that from research that muscle strength declines roughly 1 to 2% per year after the age 30, and that this actually accelerates with age, and that strength is often a strong predictor of health span and even all-cause mortality, more than muscle mass alone, which is why grip strength is a good indicator for that. We also know that skeletal mass plays a huge role in glucose disposal and bone loading and fall prevention. Based on both the physiology and what you're seeing in tonal data at scale, what would be like types of strength training that are actually most important for longevity, and why do those matter as we age?
On average, right? Cross sectional, I take a bunch of 30-year-olds and I take a bunch of 60-year-olds, and we see that you're going to have declined about 3 to 8% per decade, and then it goes faster over there. From a muscle mass point of view, strength might be as much as 10 to 15% over that same period of time, and actually power is likely to be even more. And so that's force times velocity, your ability to move quickly. And there's actually really interesting research that says power is probably the most important of those for health span. Wow. The activities of daily living, and they're the ones that we train the least, right? Climbing up the stairs, carrying the bags, they're short-term efforts of high intensity. It's not maximal strength necessarily that you need to do that. You need to do it repeatedly, or you need to do it quickly, repeatedly. And that's actually declines, 20 or so percent, per decade, certainly when you start getting 60, 70 and 80 and really fast. And so I think the exercises that we need to do or think about from a longevity point of view, from my point of view, are twofold or threefold maybe. Number one, yes, we want to preserve muscle mass for as much as we can. We can build it at any age, but we want to build it earlier. It's much like retirement, right? It's never too late, but it's never too early either. You want to build it and you want to have big reserve capacity. If it does start to decline, you want to decline from the biggest bank balance that you can occur. How do we do that? Well, yeah, in order to build muscle mass, training relatively hard, relatively close to failure. Could be lightweights, could be heavyweights. It doesn't matter necessarily on the load, but you want to go until you're close to failure. That point when you try to move the barbell or the dumbbell or the tonal fast, but it slows down by 20 or 30%, right? It's a little difficult. Those are how you want to make your sets. Number one for sort of muscle mass. For strength is best built when we're lifting relatively heavy for our percentage of our 1RM. So we want to be at 70 or 80% of our 1RM. Something that I can list for 5 to 10-ish reps. I don't necessarily need to lift singles. It doesn't need to be maximal clean and jerks or anything like that. But in the 5 to 10 rep range, maybe kind of things is how we're going to best build strength. But if you're relatively weak, my mum, that might be sit to stands, right? She's doing 10 sit to stands. That's strength training for her, and to do that. And then the power component is really about trying to groove those movements fast, do them explosively with that concentric movement. So those sits to stands become, how quickly can I stand up? And then slowly sit down. How quickly can I stand up? Then it might progress into something, like a step up. I'm trying to explode on a step up. And maybe if you want to, you could try plyometrics. You don't have to, jump training type kind of stuff. That has added benefit for bone mineral density. and kind of there. But I think it's about starting where people are. The smallest workouts you can do still make a big difference. And then, we want to hit ideally on those three parameters or those three underlying physiological concepts of is it close enough to failure to build muscle mass? Is it heavy enough to build strength? And is it fast enough to build power? And you could do one set of each per exercise. That's how sometimes I train. And I think you can get really benefits. The only other thing I'd add to that is I think single leg strength, particularly for fall prevention is really important. So our ability to be singly leg dynamically fast, right? You think about most falls happen when older people, when you trip, right? You trip, your leg goes out and you don't have the reactivity or the strength reactivity ability to apply that force quickly enough. And then you fall and then you get the fracture. Yes, we want strong bones, but it's even better if we don't fall and have to test those strong bones. And so the ability to do single leg stuff, I think is really important the older we get.
In part 4, you refer to the adoption of eccentric, overload, and drop sets. It's one of the things that I've been experimenting with myself recently. I did it years ago when I was a bodybuilder and used to get a lot of results on that. And I obviously it was more bro science than real science, but it does seem to indicate that members are increasingly adopting advanced methods like eccentric, overloads, and drop sets, tools that were once reserved for elite athletes. And I was curious, two things. One, what do you think that says about the future of strength training in general, not just for tonal, but do you think there's more people are going to start thinking about that type of training? And then secondly, from your perspective, is this, what are your thoughts about this eccentric overload and drop sets? Is it something that you really believe in? Is it something that many of us have been missing because the technology or a lot of the equipment in gyms doesn't really allow you to effectively deliver that kind of movement on a typical machine? Give me your overview of that, please, Troy.
Are these things needed? Are they foundational to building? No, absolutely not. And I love them. I think they're great. But these are additional tools. I 100% believe you get in, you lift resistance, you do it repeatedly. That's your base of your cake or your bread and butter and what you need to be doing. What we're seeing with the advent of digital resistance, whether it's Tonal or competitors in the home space, or think about eGym or Technogym in the kind of virtual spaces, these tools that were only, I had to set up these weird chains or had to have these weight releasers or I had to monopolize the whole dumbbell set because I was starting on the 50s and working down. Well, now these are a touch of a button, right? An electromagnetic resistance motor can do these. They can do them not just subjectively, they can do it based on sort of feedback, measures your range of motion, knows when you're eccentric. It can kind of control it for you. The thing it does is it opens up an avenue for training that hasn't been accessible for every people. Do I think eccentric training builds more muscle mass? I think the research evidence suggests that yes. There's a paper came out last year, compared standard sort of consistent training. It had compared that to 2 reps of eccentric training to 6 reps of eccentric training. And where you overloaded the eccentric with about 120%. And they saw greater increases in muscle mass and strength in the eccentric group that trained more. Was it dramatically different? No, it was small margin. It was significant from a research study. Is it valuable? I think so. Is it essential? No, absolutely. But I think what you're doing is you're seeing that we can bring these in as a way to progress people when they want to. Okay, well, we're doing the same exercise, right? We know that strength training can get kind of boring if you're not super into it. Like Matt and I maybe geek out about this kind of stuff, and what you're saying, bench press is never boring. But for some parts of the population, that okay, well, I want to bring in variety, but I don't want to mix up the exercises all the time. Now I can bring in eccentric overload. That's a way of progressing you that still allows you a bit of variety, gives it a little bit of interesting, has some physiological benefits, but also gives you some cognitive kind of engagement. Oh, it's a little different of a challenge here. I need to think about this. And so I think what we're seeing is that, and I think we're seeing that proliferate through our technology, as well as, these tools have not been accessible to the average population. My mum, again, when she was over from England, she did a deadlift set with chains. She's progressed from sit to stand to a deadlift. She would never go into a gym and do that, but she's trying to work on power, and chains are a really good way of working on power. And so we can bring these tools. They're not essential, but they can be valuable in the right situations. One, from a training stimulus point of view, and number two, from an engagement cognitive challenge way that just makes training more interesting for people, because that's important too.
Just looking at the shift in strength training, there's shift that anyone could notice if you go into a gym or even a hotel gym. And obviously, we've seen strength areas expand. There's been a bigger variety of equipment, which we want to get to in a minute. We've also seen women enter the strength area very comfortably now, right? Like, in fact, it may be half women and half men. Then we've seen the growth of hard rock, and these fitness, events come up where strength is a critical component of it. So if I'm thinking about the operator, and so many of our listeners are operators in our category. So if you're like a gym owner or a studio owner, and you're trying to respond to the trend that you're seeing with strength, and also planning for the future as consumers think about longevity, how do you think operators should be thinking differently about things like equipment selection and programming and different class formats, kind of given what you know about Tonal?
It's always challenging, right? Because you're making capital purchases, large capital purchases, based on the next 10 years of usage. That's kind of where you're mapping out, and you're trying to crystal ball where it is going. My personal bias is strength is not a fad. It is not something that is going to be, pop and kind of where it's going to go away or disappear. I think you're only going to see more of a tendency for people to be showing the benefits of strength training, both for physiological strength, longevity outcomes, for potential mental health and stress and kind of things. So I think within that space, it's a good bet to make. I do think there is going to be, particularly within the operator space, I do think the value of being able to digitize and quantify a lot of that. What we're seeing from Tonal's data, and obviously, Technogym and eGym are the big players, and I don't know their business, but we know more about our people that train than anyone in the history has known about training. And I think if you can start doing that for your membership and put a layer of analytics on top of that to give that to operators, like, the standard operator model is like, how many visits did they come? How long did they, what are the high level metrics? What classes did they book? Now I can know, are they getting stronger? Like, is there a variation in their types of workouts? What are they doing? I can see this because the data is collecting, the motor data is all there. And I can then use that to inform retention, engagement, upselling tools that are over there. So I do think there's going to be a massive proliferation of digital technology within that space. How that happens, whether it's purely motor based, whether it's computer vision based, but I think the data and what you see from retention, you guys could tell better than me, but your average retention in a commercial gym's, I don't know, probably churning at 2 or 3% a year, maybe higher, 3 or 4% a month. Sorry, not a year.
Whereas it's about 3% a month.
About 3% a month. You compare that to Tonal, well, sub 1%, right? Now, that's partly because we've got a device that's bolted to your wall, but it's also because we know our members a hell of a lot better than any operator has ever known them before, and therefore we can deliver what they need in a lot more sticky fashion.
Yeah, so what you're really saying is to focus on outcomes, not right. Like, and I talk about that a lot as well. It's operators need to start focusing on outcomes as a KPI, not just the things that you've mentioned, which is the standard things that we've been tracking. Matthew.
Yeah, but the other thing about looking at some of the future investments that people are making, you reference high rocks in your report, and clearly that's a big trend at the moment that seems to be gaining a huge amount of traction. And in part 3, you describe this hybrid training, which is strength, cardio, and mobility, which is becoming the new standard, with women leading diversification and men increasingly adding this to their workout program. So I was curious about this one, because if you think about the trends, how things were evolving before the pandemic, you had CrossFit, and the term that many people were using was functional training, which is essentially strength training with some of these other components. There was then this huge move to strength training, which was probably driven in part by the fact of one of the things that you weren't able to do at home that successfully, unless she was able to invest in a Tonal, was to do any form of strength training. So people went back in the gym, realized the importance of strength training. High Rocks seem to come along, and they're really pushing what many gyms are creating, or calling these hybrid or High Rock style training areas. So tell us a little bit about what you're seeing, because again, I would think of Tonal as being a strength training product or strength training company, but it's interesting when I read about this hybrid training. So just give us a little bit more insight in terms of what that means to you and how that's potentially going to shape what you see people wanting from a workout over the next few years.
I find it interesting and amusing how we market and how terminology changes and things come and go around. I want to say functional training was first coined by a coach called Vern Gambetta, who I've worked with quite extensively back in the late 90s or early 2000s. He probably coined that. He's like, I should have patented the name or trademarked it because I would have made a fortune. But we do see these cyclical kind of events within the fitness industry where it kind of gets like, Hydrox and CrossFit are not the same, but they share some, similar kind of characteristics and patterns. I think what we're seeing is strength is very much, as I said before, being the foundation as part of what they're doing. But people are realizing that I want to be able to do multiple different things. Actually, a research study came out earlier this week, prospective study, 110,000 people. And they looked at not just how much people exercise, but the variety of different exercise they did. And people who did more variety had a hazard ratio, this is correlation, not causation, of 19% lower than those that people did the same amount of exercise, but only in a single modality. So doing multiple different modalities was associated with longevity. I don't think people are necessarily thinking about the research study when they're doing, but I think people are finding benefits from doing multiple different stuff. They're getting different things out of that, right? When I do a Pilates class on Tonal, I'm not working on my strength, but my hips feel way better after doing those leg circles than they do after heavy squats. I think what people are kind of working out is, hey, it takes a range of these different things, and that's good for my overall benefit. I don't have to just get into, just into heavy lifting or just into cardio. I can kind of mix up these different varieties and get what I need out of them. I think what people are seeing is that's getting them to their solutions. Like Mo talked about outcomes before. I talk a lot about solutions, right? People like jobs to be done, Clay Christensen type kind of, Harvard Business School. But like people buy Tonal or hire their gym to solve problems in their lives. And how do we as a fitness industry help them solve their problems? And let's be honest, most people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, maximal strength or maximal muscle mass is not a massive, problem I have. I'm not as strong as I'd like to be. I don't have as much muscle mass, but that's not really moving the needle. What I'm hiring the gym or I'm hiring Tonal to do is essentially give me solutions to help me stay strong, play with my kids, do my thing, like look good when I put a swimsuit on. Those are all the jobs that I get hired to done. And so I think the more that we can package different varieties of exercise and say how they help solution or help solve people's problems, I think that becomes a really valuable piece.
So Troy, given there's a lot of development on electromagnetic resistance, and honestly, I have conversations with manufacturers and operators all the time about how to deploy this. You talked about Tonal, obviously, and eGym and Technogym, but you even see brands like Echelon and a lot of others getting into electromagnetic resistance. How is that different? So I've always wondered, I've been, because I'm training almost exclusively for strength on Tonal unless I'm traveling, which is motorized strength. The first time in my life I've done that. How is that different from just doing free weights or other or select rise machines? Should we mix in both? Does it matter? Would love to get your perspective on that.
I don't think it makes a wild amount of difference. Like your muscles know tension, they know resistance. What you get with electromagnetic resistance is you get a more constant force tension profile through the range of motion because there's less inertia, right? If you imagine Olympic lifting, you're like moving really fast, you're trying to get speed on that bar, Newton's laws of once an object is in motion and wants to stay in motion. So you're trying to get momentum because that's helping you through the motion thing. It allows you to lift a heavier weight in order to be able to do that, but it doesn't necessarily challenge your muscles necessarily in order to do that. What you find with electromagnetic resistance at the base calibration, because we can manipulate however you want, your base calibration is you don't have that same level of inertia or momentum. There's a constant force that you have to push through. So what we find is typically people are lifting about 25% less on as a resistance weight on tonal than they would in the free weight. So 200 pounds on tonal equals 250 pounds of free weight because of that motion. It's not a perfect one-to-one correlation, because if you lift slowly on a free weight, it would be more similar to lifting on an electromagnetic. I think that's sort of number one, that there's very subtle differences, the resistance around there. I think what we kind of talked around before, where I think the advantages or the benefits around that are like, you get the data out of it, where it gets you tracking in a way that you couldn't possibly understand, all of your movement patterns before, which I think can be really beneficial. But I don't think there's any particular reason why you need to, only lift on tonal or electromagnetic resistance, or only lift on free weights, or do a mix of things. I don't think it's that big a difference. I think we're talking like very subtlety differences. We're a cable machine, so we tend to be a little more stabilizer focused. There's a pivot point at the bottom, and so if the first time you bench on tonal, it feels a little wobbly, right? Because you kind of think gravity's not pushing you straight down on the dumbbell in that sense. And so, it actually really helps my shoulder. I lift a little less on tonal than I would in a free weight, but it fills up those stabilizing muscles and they're going and works around. So I think there's pros and cons. I think people should do the things that they like to do. What they enjoy doing is going to be the biggest benefit for them, getting kind of consistency and then for getting the outcomes, more so than, tiny differences in the benefits or pros and cons of free weight versus electromagnetic resistance from a user point of view.
It would not surprise me that as we go through these operator refresh cycles and equipment, in the next 15 years, if half of the equipment in the strength area at a gym is going to be electromagnetic driven, it would not surprise me one bit, just seeing some of the innovation that's happening and how it just provides so much helpful insights to members and users. Well, we're almost at time, and so one of the things that we like to wrap up on lifts, which you might recall from your last episode, are our key takeaways. So Matthew, let me start with you first. I know this is a topic that is very close to you. You've had a long journey with strength. You've actually owned a business that is purely on strength. So I'm curious to know your key takeaways.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things I wanted to say. First one, I've just listened to the Andrew Huberman podcast with Dorian Yates, and I interviewed Dorian Yates about 7 or 8 years ago, when he was really mainly known for people that are into bodybuilding or serious training, and then a few trainers. But it's quite interesting to see that someone like Andrew Huberman, that's a real mainstream podcaster, interviewed him. And I definitely recommend you listening to that, as well as listening to the one that I did with him. But just listening to some of his philosophies, and Andrew Huberman, who's obviously comes from a scientific background, almost supporting some of these really old school strength training ideas, which we've spoken about here as well. So I think that really just goes to show how much I guess mainstream and consumer awareness is now becoming around strength, and I definitely see that will continue. A couple of other things that I took from the report that I thought I'd share, more so for the operators that are listening to really take note on. But the first one was really one of the most telling stats from this report is that 80% of Tonal members say that they train primarily to age better, not to look a certain way. So that certainly starts to change the conversation or the industry messaging that a lot of times we're putting out to bring people in. It may be a good time to start shifting the people that you're targeting, so that we can, as an industry, potentially grow and attract and bring more people in. the other thing that builds upon that, it says the report also shows that older members are matching or even exceeding young ones in relative strength and power gains, largely because they're training more consistently, not necessarily that they train harder. I thought that was a really interesting takeaway as well, and there's probably a lot that could be looked into that, but certainly encouraging for people that are a little bit older, worrying about how they will compete with their sort of younger peers. And then the final one, which I thought was quite interesting, is when training is personalized and they have clear weekly targets, adaptive load, real-time feedback, members hit their goals about 90% of their time. So again, I'm referring this to many people that own bricks and mortar facilities and supporting probably the move towards more personal coaching and training as certainly being a beneficial way if you are going to a gym, how you're going to get results. But I think it's a great report. We're going to put a link hopefully to allow people to have a look at it and to take away what they wish. But probably go over to you now, Troy. What are some of your takeaways, and if you could slightly build onto that, anything that probably you've come across over the last 6 to 9 months that may not be common knowledge, but you could sort of share us in terms of some of the things that you're thinking of in your brain at the moment.
Yeah, I'll list a couple. I think number one, you talked around sort of older people and the relative gains that they make, and the research suggests this too. I don't think them necessarily. I think it is a consistency thing, is what we see in our data, but that we should take massive reassurance from that it is never too late, and that we can build strength, muscle mass, power at any age. And we've got up to 80+ year olds that are still doing those types of things, and sort of reinforcing that message as much as possible. It would be number one. Number two, the industry's done great in strength training, and we're really riding on a wave. But while there's not updated data that I've seen recently from the last couple of years, but 2 or 3 years ago when the last government report was put out, it was still only 25% were meeting or 30% were meeting the guidelines of exercising 2 times a week for muscle strengthening activities. And if you actually bucket it, there's a detailed report of that, and looks at age and then did decline. Once you start getting above 30, it's like 40% of 18 to 30-year-olds, and then 30%, and then 25%. It's like 10% of 60-year-old pluses. There's still, I think, a huge opportunity, both from an industry point of view of there is this beneficial thing, and also from an education thing to those people of how we make that change. It feels like that's in the industry that everyone knows about strength training. Dorian Yates is on Huberman and I think, but I still think we're actually relatively early on that kind of wave of what we could do. Now, it's up to us as an industry in order to be able to move that forward. But I think we still have a lot of opportunity. From a purely business sense, there is a huge TAM there of people who are not currently engaging in strength training who would benefit from it. How do we reach them better, I think, is a massive opportunity. And the third one is that I think the more research that is done on it, the more it is showing that power is actually the key for aging, or not the key, because they're all important and power is built on strength, but is probably the most important thing. Grip strength is great. It's very easy to do. We can measure it in a doctor's office. It does predict mortality quite well on a long period of time, but actually upper body decreases in strength slower than lower body. So you lose strength in your lower body faster than in your upper body, the research suggests, and you lose power faster. And what do we want to keep? We want to keep lower body power. That's the key metric that we need to care about. And so while grip strength is great, dead hangs are fine. If you want to be able to do them. But if you really want to care about longevity, train lower body power is probably the single best thing you can do for your health span, and staying injury free or fall prevention free.
Fantastic. Mo, takeaways from this week.
Yeah, I'm just constantly amazed at how some of these old school strength coaches like Charles Poliquin or concepts like, I think he made German volume training popular, but you just look at these older bodybuilders like Dorian Yates, even Arnold, right? Progressive overload. A lot of these concepts that were from the 70s and 80s are actually correct. And we're now using data and science to prove it. It's just fascinating how they were able to land on some of these things, just being obsessive over their craft. But if you zoom out, I think strength training may be the most powerful longevity lever that we have. And Troy, you even went even further to say that it's power, which is even a more specific metric. And that, from an operative standpoint, has real implications. We know the evidence today. I talked about this at the top. Higher muscular strength is associated with 20 to 30% of lower all-cause mortality. Skeletal muscle drives the majority of glucose disposal. So all the things that saying that it is really important in having a good health outcome. For operators, I think this refrains the role of the gym. And we talked about the retention that you're seeing on Tonal and some of the retention issues that we as an industry have. When members get stronger, it's got an aesthetic look. They look better, they age better, they feel better. And that actually shows up in high retention, longer member lifetimes, and improves our TAM. It could bring in people that are on GLP-1s and so on. So I think when you think about scale and operators who are thinking about how do I prepare my club, my team, my reporting for future, I think operators need to think about themselves as being a part of the preventative health infrastructure that is being built now. And they need to reframe and think about the key metrics that they're using for success and change it from some things you mentioned earlier, which is check-ins and time spent in gym and so on, what classes are you taking, to really have it focused on outcomes and focused on longevity. Because to your point, I mean, I think, Matthew, you said 80% of people in the report stated that they're doing it for longevity. And I think that resonates pretty well and accurately with how gym members are feeling. So I think there's a lot to unpack here. This has been a terrific episode, Troy. Really happy to have you back on again. And thank you so much for all that you do for us in the industry.
Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you very much, Troy. That's it for this week's episode. If you got one thing out of it, then please help us get this podcast out to more people. If you could subscribe to the channel, share it with one or two people, and if you can, leave a comment and let us know what you think. We'd be very much appreciative. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Lifts.